Now, when a Northern Ireland-only backstop was raised before, you and others said this couldn't happen because you're a unionist. And you couldn't accept different standards for Northern Ireland than for the rest of the United Kingdom. Is still that the case?
Can I just begin by saying how nice it was to see Mr. Johnson of Black Lion on your film? Because I actually met him when I went out to Black Lion, and he was full of stories of how things had happened across the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland over the decades, and he's a man whose views deserve to have a wider audience. No, he's a great figure running a shop set up by his grandmother. But
do you rule out the Northern Ireland backstop?
The backstop, the Prime Minister's been clear, must go. The undemocratic backstop must go. That we cannot allow Northern Ireland to be subject to EU rules, and we cannot separate Northern Ireland from the rest of the United Kingdom. Now, that doesn't mean that things that currently go on an all-of-Ireland basis, such as phytosanitary checks, any cattle or live animals going from Scotland over to Northern Ireland are individually checked. Nobody's proposing that that has to be changed, but to set up a completely different system would be the wrong thing to do in terms of unionism, but also in terms of the trade flows, because the majority of Northern Ireland's flows comes into the rest of the United Kingdom, not across the border with the Republic of Ireland. So you would be ignoring the bulk of Northern Ireland's trade.
Do you know what this new proposal is? Has it been cleared by the Cabinet, or are you waiting to hear from the Prime Minister?
I'm waiting to hear the final details.
That's extraordinary, isn't it, that the Cabinet haven't agreed what Britain's negotiating position is?
No, the outlines have been agreed as to what we're trying to do. That's been discussed at Cabinet, that it has been agreed that the Prime Minister is seeking to get a new deal, that he is going to get rid of the backstop and have a new political declaration. Within that, the details of the negotiation can't be done by a once-a-week hour-long Cabinet meeting.
Before you were in the Cabinet, though, you said there was much more that was wrong with the Mrs May's deal than just the backstop. I mean, you and Boris Johnson said, for example, that the 39 billion couldn't just be handed over. That had to be deferred. Have you given ground on that? Have you given up on the 39 billion?
There's no question of giving up, but the whole point of that is that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, and that it's important that any package is taken in the round.
But if there is a package that involves £39 billion as before, you would be content with that?
What I was saying before is that the 39 billion, having been agreed before we had agreed where we were going next, seemed to me not to be the best way to do it. If the total package is worth £39 billion, that's not inconsistent with what I said before.
Right, but you're basically compromising on what you used to think before you were in the Cabinet.
No. I've always been willing to compromise. I always recognised after the referendum result that there was going to need to be some compromise, and there are some areas that are fundamental. Maintaining the integrity of the United Kingdom is fundamental. Not locking ourselves into a backstop that would last forever is fundamental. The other details of the agreement are not normally fundamental, but the political declaration is going to be of great importance.
And as far as you're aware, not knowing what the deal is this a final offer, or is it a negotiation?
Well, it is part of a process. You'll have to see what the other side says. A final offer is always a debatable point, isn't it, in any negotiation?
We're always movable.
Well, but the EU said that the agreement that had been come to with Mrs May could not be reopened. We now know that that's actually not quite true. So nothing is agreed until everything is agreed is the basic principle of this negotiation.
If it proves too difficult to get an agreement imminently, and you have to extend in order to get an agreement, will you resign? Should Boris Johnson resign, having promised to Brexit by the end of October?
Boris Johnson must not resign. He must stay in office, and he must
even if you extend?
He must not extend. He has made absolutely clear that he will not ask for an extension. It would be wrong of him to do so. If the opposition parties don't like government's policy, they have a very well tried and tested route to take. That's to put down a vote of confidence and see if they can win the confidence of the British people, because ultimately it's the voters who must decide in a general election.
As you know, the law says if there is no deal, you must ask for an extension. Now, of course, it's possible Europe says no, and no deal goes ahead. But it's also possible that Europe says yes, and you have to extend. That's not in your power to change, is it? That's the law.
The basic position is that the government is aiming for a deal, in which case the Surrender Act falls away. The issue that you're raising is an interesting one. We've just seen the Supreme Court come up with a novel interpretation of the law. The law is what it's interpreted by judges to be in the end, and we'll see what interpretation they may give to the surrender bill.
So you may have to extend, is what I'm saying. So in that scenario,
I'm
would you resign?
I'm not accepting that. I'm not accepting that we may have to extend. We haven't seen what that law means. It hasn't been tested in front of the courts.
Well, the law is the law. The law says you must ask for an extension. Europe might say yes, and then you've extended.
If the law is the law in this clear way, we wouldn't need courts, because these things would always be decided
so you
before
are planning
they got
to take
there.
this to court?
We will have to wait and see what happens. I'm expecting a deal, actually. The mood music seems enormously positive. There seems to be shifting in the EU position. The Prime Minister is bringing great force and charisma to this negotiation.
But you'd have to get this through the ERG, and if you don't even know what the deal is, how on earth do you know whether Mark Francois is going to vote for it?
Well, actually, it needs to have the support of the DUP. I think that is crucial. But I think many people are really keen that we should leave on the 31st of October. I'm as interested as anybody is in Brexit, but even I would quite like to have something else to talk about. I imagine you may even be in the same position.
I look forward to those days.
Stories follow.
I fear they may be a long way off.
But don't you think this is where the country is, actually, that people want to
I don't want to speculate on where the country is. Let's talk about some sort of concrete things. Prorogation, you played a key role. You went to the Queen and you sought her approval for what turned out to be an illegal prorogation. You put her in an unbelievably awful and regrettable situation. Do you regret it? Have you apologised? You must feel wretched.
Well, some of the details of your question aren't quite right. First of all, there is a difference between illegal and unlawful. Illegal is a criminal act.
Okay, unlawful.
But it's important because
it was unlawful.
but it implies something.
You made the Queen do something unlawful.
The Queen didn't do anything that was unlawful. The Queen can't do things that are unlawful. That's a matter of constitutional principle. The judges decided...
She approved something that was unlawful. Have you apologised?
No, that's not what the court said. The court said that the advice given to Her Majesty was unlawful, and therefore...
It said the prorogation was unlawful.
No, it didn't.
It said it didn't. The prorogation didn't happen.
It didn't happen because
it was against the law.
Because the advice was unlawful. It was really important. The Queen did nothing unlawful.
Now. The
no,
point
I'm not.
is you put the Queen in an awful position.
No,
Have you apologised?
No, because this isn't right. This is an inaccurate understanding of the Constitution. As came out during the court case, Her Majesty is obliged to act on capital A advice from her Prime Minister. It wasn't a discretion.
Precisely.
The Queen did nothing.
You obliged her to act in a way
that was wrong. The Queen had to do this, and something was done that any constitutional historian you spoke to in August thought was within the remit.
Sorry?
No, I'm not sorry. I think the court judgment is wrong.
Okay, so you haven't apologised to Her Majesty?
Has said that. I think it's a very odd concept of how the government is run.
Well, I mean, you flew up to Scotland
for a Privy Council to do a completely routine thing.
Did you call it a constitutional coup, the Supreme Court ruling?
What is said in Cabinet will come out in 30 years' time.
Do you think it's a constitutional coup?
What's said in Cabinet will come out in 30 years' time. But the point here is the government thinks that the judgment was wrong, but respects the judges.
I'm putting those precise words. Would you say tonight it was a constitutional coup? Do you agree with those words?
What I said in the Cabinet is confidential, and I'm going to stick to saying...
I accept that. I'm just asking you, was it a constitutional coup?
But I'm not in favour of breaking confidences. If I said that, I said it in a confidential circumstance.
I'm asking you, was it a constitutional
I'm not
coup?
going on national television to criticise the judges. I accept the result that they came to, but I think it was wrong.
Okay, well...
No, the Cabinet is a place for free discussion, and that's really important. People must be free in Cabinet meetings to express their views and express them clearly, as long as when they leave, they accept collective responsibility in the position of the government, which of course I do.
Is there still going to be a Queen's speech before October the 31st? Are you going to prorogue Parliament again?
Well, the judgment is obviously being studied extremely carefully to ensure that any prorogation that there would be before a Queen's speech meets the requirements set out by the justices. So it is likely that there will be a Queen's speech, but it is important to make sure that the prorogation wouldn't be challenged
And that
again.
would be before October the 31st? So it could be the same date?
Well, the Prime Minister said last week it would be on the 14th of October.
So next week you could prorogue?
Well, there needs to be some time for prorogation, but the judges said that a normal prorogation would require some suspension of Parliament.
Are you looking forward to facing the Queen for that particular meeting?
It's always an honour to meet Her Majesty. Indeed, being Lord President of the Council is an enormously exciting thing to do, because I get to meet Her Majesty and Her Majesty's corgi.
It raises a few questions that have been doing the rounds about your personal conduct over the last few weeks. Lounging in the House of Commons, are you sorry?
Well, oddly I am. It's extremely traditional. Winston Churchill, when the chamber was rebuilt, had the table brought closer to the benches so that ministers could put their feet on the table. But it's a distraction, and I'd always sat like that on the backbenches and nobody cared. People seem to care more about things
Soames
that go on.
was furious. He said you were extraordinarily rude.
Nicholas Soames's
He wanted
fury
to slap you across the head.
was completely confected. He ought to remind himself that
don't
it
think
was his. Well, I think if you go back to the 1980s when Nicholas Soames was a minister, his feet would have been on the table. So I think that's, to use a prime ministerial word, humbug.
It's one of the things that perhaps has motivated the former head of Eton, Tony Little, to say today in Henley you're giving Eton a bad name. How does that feel?
Well, all I'd say is I was very lucky to be at Eton under the headmastership of Sir Eric Anderson, an enormously distinguished headmaster who managed to be a schoolmaster to the Prince of Wales, to Tony Blair, to David Cameron, to a former Prime Minister of Thailand, to Boris Johnson, incredibly distinguished academic career of Sir Eric Anderson, and I was privileged to be at Eton in his time. I didn't overlap with Mr.
One other
Little,
matter
who I
I'm sure
don't
you'll
know.
want to clear up. A lot of people are saying, including the Prime Minister's sister Rachel, that he may be being influenced by people who are betting fortunes on the pound falling in the event of a no deal. They're shorting the pound. You obviously still own, but don't get involved in the investing policies of Somerset Capital Management. Is it possible you could benefit financially from a no-deal Brexit if the pound falls?
No, because...
Will you get rich?
Can I explain what Somerset Capital Management does? It might be useful. It invests...
Well, just that question is
but
fine.
it answers the question, but it needs to be answered properly, because it's an important point. Somerset Capital Management is a long-only investment manager that invests in emerging markets. It does not take short positions in stocks or in currencies. So no, that is not the business that Somerset Capital Management carries out. And I think this suggestion is absolutely ridiculous. Hedge fund managers, and I've never been a hedge fund manager...
Well, it's Rachel Johnson who's saying it.
Well, look, even my sister makes mistakes and joined the Brexit party, so one could always defend even one's brilliant sisters. But hedge fund managers look at the markets and think, will they go this way or that way? They aren't running long-term plans of politics to see what happens. They're looking at day-to-day movements.
The Prime Minister's conduct too. Charlotte Edwards, the journalist who's made this allegation that he groped her leg 20 years ago, is very well known to you. She's written an article about how she's known you for decades. Matt Hancock said to me the other day that he knows her very well. He trusts her absolutely. Do you trust her absolutely and believe what she said?
Charlotte is an old friend of mine, a very distinguished journalist, somebody I think very highly of, but I'm simply not going to bandy a lady's name.
Do you believe her?
I'm not getting into the business of bandying a lady's name over 20-year-old gossip.
Well, do you believe the Prime Minister?
As I said, I'm not going to discuss 20-year-old gossip. I just don't think that is a suitable thing.
It goes to the heart of character.
No, Boris Johnson...
Whether he's a suitable man to be Prime Minister.
If you want to get on to Boris Johnson's character, I think he has a fine and upstanding character. I think he's a forceful, charismatic
Somebody's
leader.
lying, is the point.
And he is somebody...
Either her or the Prime Minister. Which is it?
I'm really surprised that Channel 4 is getting into this sort of gossip story. I don't think Jon Snow would ask such questions.
Well, what Jon Snow asks is up to John when he's presenting.
Very good questions,
I'll ask
precise
whatever
questions,
I think.
and not getting into
And I think
gossipy.
it's important because other cabinet ministers have commented on this, who they believe.
Look,
your colleague, the Health Secretary, principally.
I hold Charlotte in the highest regard. She's a long-standing friend. But this is tittle-tattle, and I will not bandy a lady's name.